Our first speaker this morning is Professor Richard Lynn. He got his PhD at Cambridge, and then for a time he worked at the Dublin Institute of Economic and Social Research, but his Thatcherite policies didn't mesh particularly well with the thinking down there. And he moved to the University of Ulster. He has recently retired and is now director of the Ulster Institute of Social Research, where he continues to do the kind of work that has distinguished his career in psychology. He is the author of an excellent book that was reviewed in American Renaissance called Dysgenics, Genetic Deterioration in Modern Populations, and he's just completed the manuscript of a volume we look forward to with great anticipation. It's called Eugenics, a Reappraisal. Probably his greatest contributions to the field have been his 1978 discovery, if you will, of the high IQ of the North Asians. His first population for investigation was the Japanese, and his discovery of this 105 IQ for North Asians. Not too surprisingly, this discovery was not very well received in the community, the expectation being that if you were going to start moving up in numbers from the 100 figure, there was a possibility you might move down. And in fact, some of his subsequent research has determined the African IQ on general to be at a level of 70. So the people who had their swords out and were sharpening them back in 1978 turned out to be correct. But these are the conclusions to which an unbiased appreciation of facts lead us. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium Richard Lynn, who will speak about race, European developments.
Thank you, Jared. It's a great pleasure for me to attend my first AR conference and an honor to be invited to speak to you. The growing transformation of your society in the United States into a multiracial and multicultural society has also been occurring in Europe, although not on such an extensive scale. Nevertheless, we are catching up with you and fully expect to a growing increase of the numbers of our immigrant population in the decades that lie ahead. All the major European countries in the European community have quite significant recent immigrant populations, many of which come from non-European countries. The percentages range from around 5% to a maximum of 12% in Sweden. These are official statistics gathered from census returns and are certainly underestimates of the true numbers, since many immigrants are illegals or for various reasons do not fill in census returns. And it's quite hard to estimate how many unknown immigrants escape these census data, but probably should add 2 or 3% to the official figures. These immigrants are of various kinds, depending largely on the historical ties with the countries to which they've immigrated. So France has a number of black immigrants from its former Caribbean colonies and its former African colonies, and from Algeria. We in Britain have large numbers of immigrants from our former colonies in Africa and India and in Malaysia and so forth. As a generalization, these immigrants have not, for the most part, adapted well to European culture. They have high levels of crime and high levels of unemployment, with the exception of relatively small numbers of Asian immigrants who are rather conspicuously different from those from Africa in these regards. I'm going to talk here particularly about Britain, where I know the data much more extensively than I do for continental Europe. Britain was a wholly white country up to the Second World War. And it is only after the war that Britain and the rest of Western Europe began to experience large-scale immigration from non-European peoples. The way this came about was essentially in the same way it came about in the United States through the passing of an Act of Parliament which allowed immigrants to enter the country. And the crucial Act of Parliament in Britain was passed in 1948 and is called the British Nationality Act. And the provision of this act was to give citizenship of the United Kingdom to all the inhabitants of our extensive colonies. A huge number of people in Africa, in the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere around the globe, approaching a billion people. And it's very extraordinary, I think, in retrospect, that such an act could have been passed, allowing all these people citizenship and right of abode in Britain. And it's very curious that there was so little discussion and protest when this act was going through Parliament. Hardly anyone said, hang on a minute, is this really a sensible idea to allow all these people to come and live in Britain? And a few people who raised these queries were brushed aside. It's very much a precursor of your 1965 Act, where much the same thing happened. A few people raised objections that a lot of people were going to come in under the provisions of this Act. No one took much notice of this. So it was in Britain. Nevertheless, no sooner had the Act been passed than immigrants began to arrive in Britain, largely from our Caribbean colonies, as they were at that time, and from the Indian subcontinent. It was only rather later that they used to come in, they came in from Africa. So they began coming in throughout the 1950s, and the Conservatives won the election and took office in 1952, and it is, I think one can legitimately blame the Conservatives for not doing anything to stem the increasing numbers of immigrants who came in during the 50s. This was discussed, but it was thought it would raise too many problems, and the Labour Party was a keen party of immigration at this time, and for various reasons, perhaps simply through inertia, nothing was done about it. It began to be apparent, as quite substantial numbers of these immigrants came in, that our black immigrants were a different class of immigrant from our Indian immigrants. Indian immigrants adjusted quite well to life in Britain, both economically. They worked and set up businesses, did well in school, and did not commit crimes, whereas blacks, on the contrary, had high levels of unemployment and did commit crimes on a more extensive scale than either whites or Asians. And our first race riots broke out in 1958 in the Notting Hill area of London and also in the city of Nottingham, very much like your race riots that you experience from time to time in the United States when blacks go on the rampage and destroy buildings and break into shops and loot the merchandise. And these riots were a black phenomenon. Asians don't riot in Britain, as they don't in the United States. They were a black phenomenon. So it became increasingly evident that we, as it were, saddled ourselves with a social problem. And there was more and more pressure within the Conservative Party to do something to stop this immigration, which was in fact done, or at least it was attempted, in 1962 with an Immigration Act, which brought an end to what we call primary immigration. We distinguish between primary immigration, which is the immigration of those people who would just like to come and live in our country, who are also known as economic migrants. We distinguish between this primary immigration and secondary immigration, which is all other kinds of immigration, which is of three main kinds, consisting of dependents of those who are already in, their wives and so on, illegals, and asylum seekers. So this act put an end to primary immigration. And at that time, the 1961 census revealed that there were approximately 200,000 black immigrants in Britain and approximately 130,000 Indians. And the Act provided that these people, who were mainly young men, were allowed to bring in their dependents, wives, and many of these people left their wives and dependent children in their home countries. They reckoned to establish themselves in Britain, find accommodation and so on, and then bring their wives and children over. So this was permitted under the 1962 Act. Nevertheless, people were reasonably optimistic that this would really bring an end to substantial immigration. A certain number of dependents would obviously come in, but nevertheless, we'd pretty well solve the problem. At that time, the Labour Party bitterly opposed this Immigration Act. Parties to the left are normally pro-immigration, pro-multicultural societies, and parties of the political right are antagonistic to these things, and so it was in Britain in the early 1960s. So the Labour Party bitterly opposed this act, but they revised their opinions, or at least their political postures, in 1964, when there was a general election, and one of the Conservative candidates in the city of Birmingham and in the ward of Smethwick, a candidate by the name of Griffiths, Conservative candidate, fought his election campaign under the slogan, "If you want a nigger for your neighbour, vote Labour." So posters with this slogan were printed and shown in placards over the ward, the constituency, shown in people in their windows and so forth. And he won a resounding electoral victory, from which the Labour Party drew the conclusion that there were no votes to be gained. On the contrary, a lot of votes to be lost in being a pro-immigration party. So they decided to go with the 1962 Act. So come the middle 60s, people were reasonably happy with the situation. We thought that we made a blunder by passing this 1948 Act, allowing these people to come in, but nevertheless they were here. There weren't all that many of them. They were bringing their dependents, but there wouldn't be all that many of these once the dependents came in. We could live with the situation, as it were. However, it turned out that many more people, dependents, came in than had been anticipated. Partly these were what might be called genuine dependents. They were, in fact, the wives and children of existing immigrants. And partly they were what might be called fake dependents, particularly from the Indian subcontinent. Children would be brought in, purporting to be the children of immigrants who'd established residence here, but they weren't really. And there was a big business in arranged marriages, which are traditional among Indians, by which Indians who'd established residence in Britain would marry other Indians through family networks in the Indian subcontinent and would bring in their wives. And there was much more of this immigration of dependents than had been anticipated. So it seemed as the 60s wore on, the problem had not been solved. Finally, as many people had hoped it would have been. Now, in 1968, we had what I think is a unique event throughout the Western world, that a major mainstream politician took a big public stand on the issue of in 1968, major mainstream politician named Enoch Powell, as no doubt many who have anticipated, took a public stand on the immigration issue, declared in a speech that this was a disaster, and it would simply, the numbers of immigrants would escalate, whole cities would be racially transformed, He pointed specifically to your experience in the United States of the great cities in which whites are an increasing minority. And he painted the future in quite dramatic language. It's become known as the rivers of blood speech, or quite often as the infamous rivers of blood speech, because he said in it, he was a classical scholar, so he had a lot of classical allusion at his disposal. He said in the course of each, like the Roman, I am full of foreboding, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. As he predicted civil strife between the races in the years that lie ahead. He said, how did it come about that we allowed this to happen? We are like a population who have been busy building our own funeral pyre. And then he, quoting a Greek aphorism, he said, those whom the gods seek to destroy, they first make mad. And that we must indeed have been mad to pass this act and to continue to be allowing immigrants to come in through the dependency rule. And the only solution to this problem is to repatriate them. We need a large-scale program of repatriation to persuade them, pay them. We'll pay them to go home. We had a very dramatic impact on the population, and we had this perhaps curious reaction that the population as a whole were very much behind the sentiments of this speech. So an opinion poll was carried out shortly after it, which found that 74% of the population agreed with this. And the London dockers came out on the march through the streets of London with placards which bore the legend, Enoch for PM, Prime Minister. So the population were very much behind him, but of course the intelligentsia and the politicians didn't like this at all. So the party leader was Edward Heath at this time. The Conservatives were in opposition, but he dismissed Enoch Powell from what we call the shadow cabinet. He became, I suppose, a pariah in his own party. Well, as more and more immigrants arrived, people began to do research on the kind of what you might call initially the impressions that the public had, that the Asian immigrants were of much better quality of immigrant than the black immigrants. This wasn't, as a matter of fact, surprising to many of the older generation in Britain who had had experience in running our colonial empire, much of which was in sub-Saharan Africa and much of which was in the Indian subcontinent. And the style of administration of our empire was that we put our own nationals in the top command positions, the head of the local armies, the police forces, the civil service. But we recruit local people for middle management and lower junior management positions. And the same is true in private industry. Whites would come out and actually run the businesses, like the tea plantations in India and the tobacco plantations and cotton plantations in Africa. But they'd employ local natives, as they were called in those days, to do the work and to occupy middle management positions. Now, we found through experience of running this, the empire of this kind for a century and a half or so, that this worked quite well in India. You could appoint Indians to these positions, and they were good. They were perfectly good at doing these things. But we couldn't do this in Africa. It was no use appointing Africans to these positions because they couldn't do it. And so our solution to this problem was to import Indians into Africa to do these jobs. And that was how it was that quite large numbers of Indians were imported into South Africa, where they still remain as quite a large population and do well, and into East Africa, in Kenya and Uganda, imported quite a lot of Indians there who also did the middle management, junior management, white-collar jobs, and many of them set up businesses and did well until they were, of course, expelled from Uganda by Idi Amin around 1966, after which the country has not done nearly so well. So it wasn't really surprising, this general impression that people had that the Asians were adapting quite well, that blacks weren't adapting nearly so well. But as we got into the later 60s, people began to do, social scientists began to do research on this question to get out the facts and figures for various indices of adjustment of the society, to our society. One of the first of these was an inquiry which the Ministry of Education made in the late 1960s of the numbers of children of different ethnic groups who are found to be ineducable in schools. So there's a certain proportion of children who are in schools who are ineducable because they're mentally retarded or borderline mentally retarded. Come the age of 9 or 10, they haven't learned to read or do simple arithmetic. And we have special schools, as you do in the States, for such children who are ascertained, diagnosed, their IQ is measured, and they are sent to these, what we call educationally subnormal schools, or schools for the educationally subnormal. This inquiry found over the country as a whole that the black children were being sent to these schools 4 times more than would be expected on the basis of their numbers in the population, as compared with whites and Asians. This was just one indication of the poor performance of the black children in schools, which began to be increasingly evident. About the mid-1970s, the government set up a commission to inquire into this problem and its causes, and it took a long time to produce its report. Racial minorities were represented on this commission, and it was hard to get any agreement among them as to what the causes, among the commission as a whole, what the causes were. But an appendix to the report was a study carried out by Nicholas McIntosh, who is professor of psychology at Cambridge, into the intelligence of the different racial groups. And this appendix said that it produced evidence, which perhaps we could share in the first transparency here. Well, these are the results that McIntosh produced, showing that the black children had an IQ of 88.2, the Asians of 97.7 in relation to a white IQ of 100. And discussing these, he said, well, it's quite straightforward why blacks don't do well at school. They're not so intelligent as whites, so you wouldn't expect them to do so well at school. There's been a number of other studies done in Britain. They all produce very much the same kind of result. The black IQ is a little bit higher than you find in the United States, where it's around 84, 85. This is almost certainly due to a selective immigration effect, that it's the brighter, these are mainly Caribbeans, some coming from India, from sub-Saharan Africa, but it tends to be the brighter ones who migrate to England. So they have slightly higher IQs than those who are left behind, or those who are in the United States who aren't self-selected migrants. And as the years rolled on, various studies were done of similar expressions of adjustment to the society. In the last 10 years or so, we in England have, as a means of dealing with the problem of educational standards in schools, have instituted a system by which we test all 6-year-olds and then 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds, test them out of the country and for their educational attainment. So that partly we have the facts and figures on this matter, and partly as teachers, school principals, head teachers can be warned that people and children in our school aren't doing very well, or this particular child isn't doing very well. We have a kind of national yardstick against which to measure both group, the performance of schools and the performance of individual children. So I'll show you in the next transparency the result of a recent, these tests take place once a year. Now we now come to divide our immigrants to more finely grained categories, and into the blacks. So these are how official figures in the census and in social inquiries are normally presented. The blacks are divided into Caribbean blacks, the African blacks into what is this called other blacks, who may be a mixture of both, or black-white, result of black-white unions and so on. So far they're concerned, you see that the whites on the left-hand bar do the best. Apart from the Chinese on the extreme right-hand, we've got a smallest Chinese community in Britain, about 600,000. They do the best of all, as you can see there. It's very similar, of course, to your experience in the United States, where the Asian, particularly the Chinese and Japanese and Koreans, as distinct from Filipino, other South Asians, Filipinos, and people from Southeast Asia. It's particularly these North Asians who do well. As your experience in the States, they score much higher on the mathematical section of the Scholastic Aptitude Test, for example. It's hard to keep them out of the elite universities, particularly in computing and physics and mathematics and things, so they're so good. We've got exactly the same experience here. Even at the age of 6 to 7, our Chinese immigrants are doing very well. So none of all the blacks don't do so well as the whites, but you see that those who are from Black Africa do rather better than the other blacks than the Black Caribbeans. The reason for that is there's been quite a substantial selective immigration factor from Black Africa. A lot of our Black Africans come as students, enroll in universities, and then don't go back. So we're kind of getting the elite from Black Africa. They don't do as well as white children, but they do better than Caribbean children. Turning to the Indians, we have, by this time, the Indian subcontinent is split up into the 3 independent countries, of course, of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So we differentiate these 3 types of people from the subcontinent now. It's a general finding, which we see here, that the Indians do best of these 3 groups. And they do virtually as well as whites, as you can see, as they did an intelligence test we saw some time earlier. But the Pakistanis and Bangladeshis don't do as well. We're not quite clear why that is. A lot of these Bangladeshis and Pakistanis are relatively recent immigrants who don't speak English yet and haven't really adjusted very well to society. So maybe that's a substantial factor, and they'll do better in due course. Time will tell, as people say. Well, now we also have public examinations which all children take. In Europe, it's quite common to have public examinations which children take in mid-adolescence, like the baccalaureate in France. And we have one which we call the General Certificate of Education, which children, adolescents take at the age of 16. They take these in 8 or 9 academic subjects, and you get points for these. And these points can be added up to give you a total score. And I'll show you the results of that in our next transparency. These are aggregating the Asians into a single group in this public examination. A few years back, these statistics are all much the same from one year to the next, based on there are about 700,000 adolescents take these exams. You've got a very large sample size with quite reliable results from one year to another. So you'll see, it's really becoming quite repetitive, this. The whites and the Asians do pretty much the same. The Asians just do slightly less well than the whites, but there's very little in it, and the blacks do rather substantially worse. Now, if we could show the next transparency, please. Here we see men from different groups with university degrees, which were obtained from the 1991 census, which is our last major source of information about how the various racial groups in Britain are doing. And you see that 7% of whites have university degrees here. This is the total population. Of course, university education has expanded a lot in recent years. So many more. It's not 7%. It's not 7% of the 20-year-old cohort who are in university, or a 25-year-old cohort who have university degrees. These include people. Not many people went to university. Anyhow, you see that as against the standard of whites, rather few Caribbean blacks have university degrees, less than half. That's because they're not very intelligent, they didn't do well at school. But we have quite a high rate of graduates among black Africans. This is because I was saying a few minutes earlier, quite a substantial number of black Africans come in as students and obtain degrees and remain here. And the other blacks, about halfway between, is a kind of mixture of Caribbean blacks and African blacks. And then turning to the Indians, you see, those in the subcontinent, we see the same patterns we saw among the 6-year-olds a little while ago. The Indians do well, slightly more university graduates than among whites, but the Pakistanis and the Bangladeshis do not do so well. Can we show them the next transparency, please? Well, the census also gave us data on the proportions, percentages of the unemployed among these different racial groups. And you see here against the yardstick of whites with 10.9% of unemployed. Well, you'll see at the other end of the right-hand end of this diagram, the Chinese have even fractionally less unemployed than the whites. Just another index of their good adjustment in the society. Blacks have this rather high level of unemployment, 25% of them, a quarter of them are unemployed. The Indians don't have, the unemployment level isn't very much greater than the whites. But the Pakistanis and the Bangladeshis, they also have these high levels of unemployment. A lot of them don't speak English, as I was saying, so they're not very employable. Could we have the next slide, please? Well, here we move to crime. There's a lot of interest, of course, has been a lot of interest in the States in the race differences in crime, which Jared Taylor was published this excellent pamphlet, The Colour of Crime, setting out extensive and recent data. But of course, in the States, it's been known from various studies for quite a long time that there's a high crime rate among blacks. And there's not a very high, Asians don't commit crime much. We have just the same experience here. These percentages are done, these particular data which are presented, gone out by our Home Office, they put whites as 1 as a standard against which to compare the other groups. So what the bars mean is that for every one white in prison, among black men, there's 6.1 blacks in prison. It's very very similar disproportion as you have in the States. Right? The numbers of blacks in prison is very close to 600% excess as compared with whites. And it's even higher among black women. I haven't seen the racial, I don't think Jared in his collection broke down the sex differences, or as we have to say, the gender differences in crime in the United States, as I recall. But it's a rather curious finding that the black women are even more overrepresented in prison than black men. One of the major reasons for this is that blacks are heavily involved in the drug importation business, and they use black women as what are called mules in importing drugs. They go to the country where the drugs are obtainable with a young black woman, and they slip the drugs into her suitcase. And she goes through the immigration and custom controls, where we employ sniffer dogs on quite an extensive scale, particularly on blacks coming from Nigeria or coming from Thailand, Pakistan, where these drugs are bought. So it's the young women who are the fall guys, as it were, in these importation of these drugs, who are apprehended and sent to prison. And you'll see that the crime rate among Asian men is fractionally lower than among white men, as indexed by their presence in prison, and among black women is very much lower. I find it both surprising, when I was getting out these data for the purpose of this lecture, I was both surprised and unsurprised that the data came out like this. Anyway, it's very unsurprising that we should find these results, because the blacks in Britain are very much the same kind of people as blacks in the United States, descendants of slaves that we took over in the 17th and 18th centuries, and we unloaded some of them in our Caribbean islands, and we took the rest on to the southern United States. So they're very much the same kind of people. It's not at all surprising that they should display the same kind of behavioral characteristics and the same kind of intelligence as your blacks over here do. These crime differences by race are not wholly to be explained by intelligence differences, in my opinion, though there are some who think otherwise, notably Robert Gordon, the sociologist at Johns Hopkins. But these data were well analyzed by Richard Lynn and Charles Murray in the Bell Curve, where they matched blacks and whites for intelligence. And when you do that, they find that although the disparity between the races in crime rates diminishes, it's by no means totally extinguished. They found that when you match blacks and whites for intelligence, blacks are still committing crimes 2.5 times as much as whites. So it's partly the fact that they're less intelligent, but partly there's something else which the Hearns and Murray just left open for, they invited people to solve this problem. And so there are, I think, what we might call broadly non-cognitive differences between the races, as well as the intelligence differences. And no one's really quite, in my opinion, quite crystallized out what this is. Michael Levin discusses it in his book, Why Race Matters, and he discusses the fact that blacks don't seem to have a capacity to delay gratification, and in terms of an economist concept of time preferences, blacks want things now, they're not willing to delay. If they want something, it's in a shop window and like to grab it. They're not willing to kind of delay, work for it, and pay for it. So several people have been, as it were, thinking around this issue of non-cognitive differences between the races which contribute to the crime difference. Another difference which has come quite striking in Britain is the difference in marriage, which I think we should have on the next transparency. Blacks have a low propensity to marriage. They don't take naturally to marriage. You've found this in the United States, and it's exactly the same in Britain. Here we have last year's survey was carried out in Britain in 1974, from which these data are taken. And these are just the percentages of adults under 60 in these various racial groups who are married. And you see against a white standard of 60% who are married, and only 39% of blacks are married. Whereas among these other races, always on the Indian subcontinent are more likely to be married than whites, and Chinese fractionally more. Now, when I first looked at these data, I thought, well, maybe it's just the blacks don't actually go into go through the ceremony and have it all formalized. Maybe they cohabit, But it turns out this isn't so. And we show this on the next transparency. Blacks don't enter into monogamous male-female partnerships. We don't seem to have that, but perhaps you could take that off for a minute. I'll just, maybe they're out of order or whatever. But anyhow, the long and short of this is, even if you ask if you ask them whether they're in a partnership or whether they've ever been in a partnership, you get much lower percentages of blacks than you do of these other groups. And you have just exactly the same thing in the States, and people wonder why it is. And there's been quite a same discussion in the social science literature of why blacks aren't married. They don't marry nearly so much as whites or Asians or Hispanics come to that. And people at various states have been floated. Well, a prominent theory in the States is that there are not many marriageable black males. A lot of them are in prison or they're unemployed. So, but that is, when this theory or purported explanation is examined closely, it doesn't really account for very much of it. There does seem to be some kind of natural, was more of a natural, put it in a different way around, there's more of a natural propensity to marry, which just simply expresses the formation of a love relationship and of a monogamous pair bonding to produce children. This propensity is more strongly developed in whites and Asians, and it is in blacks than it is in blacks, apparently. And this is part of, can be handled by Professor Rushton's RK theory, that whites and Asians have a stronger investment in rearing children who are most effectively reared by monogamous males and females as two adult males and females rearing children. And it is the lone parent style of having and rearing children, which is typical of blacks, both in the United States and in Britain. Let's have a look at the... oh, sorry, we have found this. You found the transparency for us. Yes, this just asks, although blacks don't marry, they have children. They don't form relationships even of any serious nature. They have children. And our blacks are very much like your blacks in this regard. Adolescent blacks have quite a lot of children, so they don't have husbands or partners. And here you'll see the proportion of what we meant to call women, girls, 16 to 19, who have dependent children, and 6% of white girls of this age group have dependent children. 21% of black girls do, Caribbean ones, this particular inquiry, very, very few. Indians have a strong family, a more stronger traditional family-based sexual morality than whites do. And Pakistanis, that seems to be less so. Perhaps we could shift on to... so this is the same kind of data. These are not teenagers, but all women who are lone parents. And this picks up the same kind of phenomenon. The blacks aren't in monogamous relationships with men. They're lone parents much more than whites or Indians or Chinese. You'll see that 9.6% of the population are lone parents among whites, 28% among blacks. Thank you. Well, here is an economic index. So social economic class 1 is the professional or senior managerial classes, according to the way we categorize socioeconomic status, as you do here. And this is data from the 1991 census of males of this age, 21-49. You'll see that 12% of whites are in this class 1, and 5% blacks, and so this is the second generation. Now, we have this rather interesting phenomenon that although quite appreciable numbers of blacks who come into Britain as immigrants from Africa come in as students and become professionals, as we saw some slides back, in the second generation you get regression effects. And their children are not doing nearly as well as their fathers. This has been found in the United States as well, that immigrant blacks do quite well, but their children regress, as we say in genetics. Why this happens is a great mystery to sociologists and demographers, sociologists who study these phenomena. They can't understand why the first generation come in as graduates and professionals, the children don't do well, but these are quite well known in psychology and genetics as regression effects. If you take any elite group, the children don't do as well as the parents, and particularly so among blacks. It's been shown among, for intelligence. If you match blacks and whites for socioeconomic status and take the top socioeconomic status shown in the United States, the black children of professionals don't do as well as the white children of professionals. So you're picking up the same phenomenon here in the second generation. And you'll see that, as I say, in the first generation, blacks from Africa are doing quite well. In the second generation, they're not doing any better than black Caribbeans. And you'll see black Indians doing quite well in these kind of jobs. These kind of jobs don't include small entrepreneurs, shopkeepers, in which, restaurateurs and so forth, in which blacks are quite prominent, so they don't appear all that much in socioeconomic class 1. Can we show them the next transparency, please? That's all. Oh, right, thank you. Okay. So, you see, we've got quite a lot of data, not so extensive as yours in the States, on all these phenomena. Well, now, when Enoch Powell made his speech in '68, he predicted that there would be, the growth of numbers would continue, it would become uncontainable, whole cities would be transformed into non-white cities, and there would be increasing social conflict. And even civil war, he predicted, between a racial civil war would appear in due course. And many, of course, the commentators scoffed at this idea. And I myself thought that this was perhaps going a bit over the top when I first read this prediction. But nevertheless, a lot of this has turned out exactly as Enoch Powell predicted it would. The numbers did grow, and they've grown really at an extraordinary rate. I mentioned the 1961 census. We found there were approximately 1/3 blacks and Indians combined, 200,000 blacks, 130,000 Indians. By the 1991 census, there were 900,000 blacks, increase of 4.5-fold, and there were 1.5 million Indians, gone up from 130,000 to 1.5 million, more than a 10-fold increase. So it's been a huge increase, sort of taken together slightly over a 10-fold increase over this 30-year period. And so I was right about that. They come in through, there are 3 major avenues of getting into the country. Partly they come as dependents and as fake dependents. So significant numbers will come over and arrange marriages here. There are agencies set up this kind of thing in the immigrant community, produced someone who has nationality here. And it's all very slackly policed and monitored by what I call registry offices, in which you can go and be married. You just turn up with someone who produces a British passport, if you're a male, or vice versa, or female, they produce their British passport, and they marry you and give you a marriage certificate, and then you thereby acquire citizenship. And this is done for a fee, and a living is made out of it by people who organize this kind of thing. So quite a lot of coming in through these fake marriages. There is an extensive business in arranged marriages still with the Indian subcontinent. Someone with a daughter here will arrange for her 20-year-old daughter, will arrange for her to be married through family networks with someone in the Indian subcontinent, so to go out and get married, and then the husband can come in. Quite often these young women, as they become kind of anglicized, kick up when they're told that we've arranged a marriage for you. Pakistan, you're coming over next week to be married, and there's a certain amount of complaint about this, but the Indians have their ways of dealing with these objections. They take them over on, let's say we're going for a holiday or we're going to meet grandma, and when they get over in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, they take our passport away and she put under great coercive pressure. And so she goes through the ceremony and the man is brought back to England. And then there's an extensive numbers of illegals come in various ways. They come over as, say, tourists or holiday makers and never go back, or come in under fake passports, that kind of thing. And then there's a growing problem of asylum seekers. We have quite substantial numbers of asylum seekers. We've got about 70,000 asylum seekers, so-called asylum seekers, coming in a year. And each of these has to be processed. Their claim for asylum has to be examined to see whether it's legitimate and acceptable. If they're turned down, as they're not deemed genuine asylum seekers, then they have the right of appeal. It takes 18 months there's a huge backlog of these people. You see, there's over 100,000 backlog of these people at the moment in Britain. Then even once the 18 months, then eventually it's heard, it's turned down. Then they can appeal, so there's a delay or something, and then by the time they've just vanished into the population, or they found someone to marry, or they're just allowed to stay. So virtually all these people stay in practice. Hardly any of them are ever sent back. So, as I say, I even predicted civil war, which, as I say, I thought was going. Even I shared the views that this was rather extreme. But I think if you think of civil war in the broad context, it is correct to say that we are in a situation of civil war. It's not exactly like your American Civil War, or our English Civil War of the 1640s, where the two armies lined up and come together and slog it out for a few hours, and a lot of people are killed, and one side wins. It's not exactly that kind of civil war. When you extend the concept, there's a lot of racial killings, a lot of racially motivated attacks and killings. The police, the white police, are racially motivated and harass and arrest the blacks and kill them. It's not infrequent in Britain for the police to, well, I wouldn't say kill them, but it's not infrequent for blacks to die in prison. Blacks die in prison much more commonly than whites do. And what typically happens is the police arrest a black and you bundle him into the back of their police van, take him off to prison, put him in the cell for the night. The next morning he's dead. And so some reason is found why he's dead. He struggled, so several of us had to get on top of him and sit on him, and unhappily he suffocated. That's the sort of story. It's happening. The black community, of course, protests about this. But this happens. So, I mean, this is a form of low-level race warfare, I think, civil war. I think it's a useful concept that we are actually living in a low-level civil war. The same thing, I think, in perverse jury trials, where blacks, as it were, get their own back by not bringing convictions against blacks, where the blacks are obviously guilty. Well, sometimes when I talk to my American friends, they say, well, America's in a pretty bad way. We all know from these census predictions that whites are going to go in a minority in about 50 years' time. The scenario for the future is not good in the States, but Europe will remain as a custodian of European civilization. So we can look on the bright side, but I reluctantly come to the conclusion it's not like that. I think I think immigration is unstoppable. The immigration of third world peoples into the West, I think, is unstoppable, as long as we retain democratic structures. There's no real way we can stop asylum seekers coming in. We've all signed the Geneva Convention, which says we're willing to give refuge to asylum seekers. It's impossible to envisage that we will withdraw from our commitment there in any of the Western countries. There's no way we can stop illegals coming in. I know many of my friends here talk about strengthening the fence along the Rio Grande and having more guards. I don't think that's going to do anything significant to stop the numbers of illegal immigrants. It's unstoppable. It's not feasible to identify them and deport them. Even if you do, they come back again. It's not feasible to stop these arranged marriages. That's the third loophole. So I'm afraid I've come to a gloomy conclusion that the numbers of immigrants is going to grow indefinitely into the future. And we in Europe too, and perhaps on a longer time scale than you in the United States, but we Europeans in Europe are going to become a minority in our own country sometime towards the end of this century.
Anyone with questions, please address them to Professor Lynn.
Yes, Israel defends its borders, why can't we?
Well, I don't really know the answer to that question. It may be a smaller country to contain. It may be less people wish to go to. We have partly we're a magnet because of our high quality of life and our generous welfare provisions. I would think may well be a part of the answer to this. There are about 3 billion people in the third world who live in poverty, who would very much rather live on welfare or working in low-level occupations in the advanced West than they would remain in their own countries, and so that's why it's unsolvable. I can't really tell you the answer to the Israel question, but
a comment there. I noticed when Hitler tried to get Germans into England, the English were able to keep them out. So it can be done physically under very difficult circumstances even. But the question I had, I believe you said near the beginning, maybe I misheard you, that in Sweden about 12% of the population were immigrants. Did I hear that correctly? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Are you inviting people to? Yes.
How optimistic are you about designer children?
The question is about designer children. This is genetically engineering our own children. Well, I'm quite optimistic about that. I mean, I approve it, so I'm optimistic, but I think it's inevitable. We have the technology to potentially, and to some degree actually, to diagnose genetically the genetic qualities of an embryo and to select which one is going to be, this is done through in vitro fertilization, to select which one will be implanted and which one won't be, and therefore to engage in producing a designer child. This is already done quite extensively in the advanced world as a way of screening out children with genetic diseases. You simply diagnose, you simply fertilize 10 or so of these over and grow 10 or so embryos and diagnose them genetically and to implant ones that are healthy. And I think it's inevitable, never mind whether you approve it or not, I think it's inevitable that this will come to be done for intelligence and personality characteristics, perhaps for physical characteristics, beauty, height, things of that kind. This will evolve spontaneously in the West, I think, through the market. Clinics will set out to provide this facility, and the couples will adopt them.
We managed to limit immigration before 1965 when we were closer to limited constitutional government than we are now. I don't understand why we can't do it again and still maintain a limited constitutional government.
Well, I hope you're right, and I'm unduly, I very much hope you're right, and I'm being unduly pessimistic about this, but I think this snowballs up, as it gets known in the third world through family networks. It becomes known that it's easy to get into the advanced world, and you can then live on welfare or in the underground economy, or you can even work, and it's very much better than life in your own countries. And this wasn't known so much in the 50s and 60s, and there was less of an immigrant community which these people could join. When these immigrant communities are extensive and well established in our countries, then these people can go into these communities, and they have a social and support network much more easily than they can when there are relatively few of them. So.
I'm sorry, that's the end of our time for this first speaker.